Well. Look at us now, Jason. We're back, baby. We're back.
I take credit? Can I take credit for that professional intro, or I can't take credit at all because it's really Tyler working the ones and twos behind the scene.
I'm not giving you any credit. It was so well done. It was clearly Tyler who did it. Well, look, it's been so long since we've done one of these. I honestly don't even remember how the beginning disclosure is supposed to go. So let's just wing it. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Pirates of Finance, the show about all things business, finance, anything that we find interesting. Actually, I really want to talk about Welcome to Wrexham. You've been giving me some great recommendations for shows and books lately. So this might just become a show and book review episode. I don't know. We'll figure out what we get into. What it certainly isn't, though, if we're going to say this show is one thing or not one thing, it's not advice. And it's definitely not financial advice. I just want to make that perfectly crystal clear. We're just two guys throwing around random ideas on a Thursday afternoon who haven't spoken or seen each other for 3 weeks. This could get a little wacky. It could get crazy. Don't get any crazy ideas from it. You're listening to two complete strangers on the internet. Keep that in mind. Now, with that said, Jason, welcome back. There have been so many exciting things that have happened for both of us in the last 3 weeks, which we are legally obligated to not talk about on this show. I had like bullets. I was like ready to get into all this stuff with you. And as we were discussing beforehand, nope, can't talk about that. Can't talk about that for compliance reasons. Can't talk about this for regulatory reasons. So honestly, 90% of the things I was excited to talk about were just blown out the window. So, but what I do want to talk about, which again, like this is going to become a book review or like a couple of books that I read over the last couple weeks in your absence, and a show you recommended to me, really got my business brain going. So the first was And a Bottle of Rum, which you recommended to me, which is U.S. and world history through the lens of rum. Really fascinating history book. The second was Bubble in the Sun. So people may or may not know, I recently moved from New England down to Florida. As a lifetime New Englander, I had a lot of apprehension about moving to Florida. My general view of Florida, perhaps not that positive. This book was a really fascinating history about how we created Florida. And by we, I certainly don't mean me or you. I mean just humans, like literally dredged all these canals and, broke through the Everglades, and really it was a feat of human engineering that Florida is what it is today. Gave me a whole new appreciation for Florida and the historical context of Florida and the role Florida played in the Great Depression. And then finally, you recommended to me to watch Welcome to Wrexham, which is an awesome TV show about Rob McElhenney and Ryan Reynolds buying a football club in Wales and the trials and tribulations of trying to get them promoted out of this shitty league and work their way up, and the amount of money they're spending. And I just, like, the reason I'm bringing this stuff up, which none of which has to do with all the crazy things that have happened in markets in the last 3 weeks, is like, it just got my business brain firing on so many different topics that I know you love this stuff because you recommended all three of these to me. But where I want to begin is actually in the last place, which is Welcome to Wrexham. And again, I am just so drawn to this new business model, or curious about this new business model of like influencer as asset, right? Being able to unlock the value of an asset because you are an individual who has a large marketing brand persona is just a really fascinating modern thing. And arguably, I would say the Kardashians have exploited this better than anyone. But I just want to drop that on your lap, see where you run with it. Welcome to Wrexham. Fantastic show, in my opinion. But I'm curious as to what, someone who watched it, what your business take was as you watched.
Before we get into the influencer marketing of that, I just want to let you know, we got huge news here. Do you see Liquid Death now has flavored waters? I come back to the US and this is a severed lime flavored water. So I'm just trying to get that influencer marketing deal on the water side for us.
Thank you.
Just trying to, let me get a delicious. The only thing, they have agave in them, so I'm not sure how I feel about that. But they're still only allegedly 20 calories in the flavored water ones. But they have like berry, lime.
Really quickly, I want to point something out before I let you talk, because I've just been hogging the mic the whole time. I'm so excited. I want to point out, when we talk about some of this like regulatory stuff that prevents us from talking about what we're doing, I just want to point out that your Twitter handle is now different. And I know that's for regulatory reasons. So when people like don't believe us sometimes that like, oh, you're making this up, you just don't want to talk about it. No, like Jason had to change his Twitter handle for compliance and regulatory reasons.
Yep. Welcome to our world of just absolute nonsense. Actually, I shouldn't even. When it's good, like now the regulations are in my head. Now I said that, I'm like, if somebody watched that, now we're in trouble again. So let's just move past that. But the welcome to Wrexham. The other reason I recommended it to you is like sometimes I feel like Rob McElhenney, and that you're Ryan Reynolds, and that I just talk you into these hapless ideas that I have, and then you're just drug along for the ride, and you're like, how did I ever get into this? And it was just me like convincing you that this would be a good idea to do a show together. But what's been interesting, like you said, it's the influencer marketing piece. So they're like 5th division in the UK soccer leagues, which is like, that's what I'm saying, it's 5th the way down. And so the idea that they're going to go for promotion and everything is kind of nonsensical. They really have, and when you watch it, they have no idea of how like the British soccer system works at all. But like you're saying, to the influencer marketing side, is that, you know, they take over this club, and just with the first season of Welcome to Wrexham alone, I believe they brought in like 3.75 million for the club. It was something like 250K a show, and then the show's been so popular they picked it up for season 2, and I haven't seen the numbers for season 2 yet, but I'm sure they're going to bring in even more money. And for a club of that size, that is an enormous windfall. Absolutely enormous. And I'm sure you noticed when you were watching it, is like, not only that, they have kit sponsors, jersey sponsors, like TikTok, Expedia, like they are getting like world-class brands.
But then I'm also saying like Ryan Reynolds cross-promoting aviation gin on everything, right? Mint Mobile's in this show a whole bunch.
Yeah, no, they know what they know exactly what they're doing. And even bigger, probably bigger than all of that, is they also were like the first 5th division club to get into FIFA, to the video game. And that's also why you could get TikTok, Expedia, and then that's why he uses his aviation in there, because when people go to play with those players on FIFA, they're going to have those same jerseys. And so it's going to have the same sponsors. So it's absolutely brilliant. Like, this is actually, I think we may have talked about this on a show a long time ago, but Burger King was genius. Somebody at Burger King figured out that like FIFA was going to like have like new, like down to the 2nd or 3rd division. So they sponsored like a 3rd division club in the UK with Burger King on their jerseys, and then did this whole like social media campaign. And it was like 3 years in advance. And then all of a sudden they became like the #1 team on FIFA, because they're giving away like free Burger King coupons and everybody who played with them. So it was like a genius like marketing play. So once again, like obviously Rob and Ryan, especially Ryan, is no dummy when it comes to social media influencer marketing. And this is just a brilliant play. And then I understand though that maybe the audience, or even the locals in Wrexham, which is in northern Wales, for those you don't know, what's actually interesting, it's pretty close to Liverpool and Manchester, so it's actually, you know, pretty close to some sizable population hubs. But the question will be, over the long term, you know, are they going to keep investing in the club? You know, how long will they be around? You know, what happens if they stay, you know, in the 4th or 5th division for years and years and years on end, and they're burning through cash, and like they're no longer having like a show on Hulu? You know, what kind of happens in that scenario, and will they stick around?
It did strike me, there's seriously been a significant cash infusion, and the way they tell the narrative in the show, and I'm not done with the first season yet, you know, they do make it very much about the people of the town, and a lot of their incentive of this team was that they wanted to feel connected to the town, right? So it was about the revitalization of the town, this very historic football field. I think the oldest international football field still in use, called the race course. So there's a lot of history there. Rob McElhenney talked a lot about how it reminded him of growing up in Philadelphia. So, you know, they sort of like, you know, they made it seem like they were there for the long run. But it was interesting to me, like this cash infusion, not only from them buying the club from the previous owners, who were actually townspeople who had saved the club, but also all this, you know, money they were able to get from sponsors clearly allowed them to buy talent in both coach and players in a way that they can, I don't want to say they can buy themselves up, but they certainly, compared to prior years, at least for where we are in the season, have done significantly better. Right. So it is a question of like, okay, if they can buy their way up, at least they do start to recoup some of that money. But if they can't buy their way out of the league and they actually start to struggle for 2 or 3 years, I mean, they're going to be on the hook for millions of dollars a year.
Yeah, like you said, their payroll is much higher than anybody else in the league, and so, like you said, they can spend more. What's been fascinating is like how they've acquired like some of these strikers from like second and third division teams to come all the way down to the fifth division, right? And that's terrible for their career. But the way they must be incentivizing them, and I don't know, like saying like, look, you're going to be on TV, it's going to help your career, or just give us a season or two, or whatever they're telling them.
Well, and the amount they're paying them, like they were paying one of them who they brought down 2 leagues.
Yeah.
I think they reportedly were paying him £300,000 per year.
Yeah.
So just that, big salary bump. Gets to be in FIFA, which he was not going to be in the league he was in, right? Like this very weird workaround by going down 2 leagues, you're going to make more money and all of a sudden be in FIFA and be on TV in a way you never would have been known before.
Yeah. Well, so what you don't know, what's fascinating about this, obviously, my girlfriend always makes fun of me because I love getting up on the weekends, first thing in the morning, especially when you're on the West Coast. Like right when you wake up, you can turn on the TV and you start watching the English Premier League, the top division in England. And it's on early in the mornings because of the time difference and everything. Like I always say, I'm so excited to watch it. And then like 15 minutes into watching it, I start Googling the team owners, all their finances. I started looking at the business of it. And like I never actually watched the games per se, but that's what I love doing. But there's a long history that people don't realize this. The top division is called the Premier League. The second division, so to speak, is called the Championship. And what people don't know is like that's one of the biggest windfalls in sports is when you can get promoted from the Championship to the Premier League. It's roughly $150 million a year windfall. So the way it works, by the way, British soccer, for people that don't know, is every year 3 teams get relegated. The bottom 3 teams go division below, and then the top 3 teams from the lower division get promoted to the next division. And this is why American owners hate this league because we're just locked in if you're an NFL or NBA owner. And so what happens is if you can get your club promoted from the Championship to the Premier League, due to the worldwide TV deals that the Premier League gets, and they distribute across all the teams, it's about $150 million a year bump from the Championship to the Premier League. And so that's the biggest windfall. And then even if you get relegated back down, you do still get a percentage of that. They had to figure out like kind of a golden parachute because poor teams were like getting promoted, relegated. And you imagine like developing your payroll. So the same thing now is like with these guys paying more for the players and increasing their payroll to try to get a division is the same thing would happen to the Championship to the Premier League. As soon as you get in the Premier League, now you're going to increase your payroll. You're going to get international caliber talent. But if you get relegated back down, you still have that payroll. And what do you do? Because now your income's a lot less. So it's just a nightmare, actually.
So how do you manage those contracts? And how do you knowing you've got multi-year contracts and you need to smooth that revenue? You can't just step up immediately. But if you don't step up, right, you're not going to get the same talent. You don't spend that extra 150. So it almost becomes like this horrible like chase, right?
Yeah, and then the Championship is a graveyard of billionaires from around the world that have just poured money into championship teams trying to get them up into the Premier League so that they could be a Premier League owner. And then because it's then becomes what they call it the most competitive league in the world, that it's even more competitive than Premier League because you have all these billionaires just trying to pay their way in and get that windfall profit and then probably flip the team eventually. And so that's why it's so incredibly difficult. And so go ahead.
No, I was thinking to myself because the other show you made me watch that I've now fallen in love with was the F1 show on Netflix. Yeah, all your recommendations have been ace so far, which is great. But I was the thing that I was thinking to myself was, talking about the graveyard of billionaires. It's interesting that in most sports, the owner is an individual.
Yeah.
Right. But in F1, the owners are corporations. Like why don't you have like BMW step up and buy a German soccer team?
So okay. Man, now you want to really get into nuance. In the F1, yes and no. Like the Constructors' Cup is like you're going to have basically a lot of the auto manufacturers on the teams, like you said, but there are some individuals like Stroll from Canada, et cetera, that's now part of Aston Martin, even though he's bought into Aston Martin as well. So you are correct. So I believe, and I could be wrong about this, in the British system is kind of almost like the NFL, where you have to have like one primary majority owner, where it can't just be a consortium. And so that would obviously eliminate a corporation. But what you actually have in German, it's surprising that you said, why wouldn't BMW buy a German team? In Germany, the laws are different and nobody can own, 51% has to be owned by the fans. So in German clubs, 51% is owned by the fans, and then like 49% can be owned by like Volkswagen. And so you actually have that in Germany. but it's still owned by the fans. And then, sorry, let me finish. And then in Spain, for example, it's primarily owned by what they call the socios, which are like members. So it's like the Green Bay Packers, where it's owned actually by the members, and nobody actually owns a lot of these Spanish clubs like Real Madrid or FC Barcelona. And so it's been really interesting now with Barcelona's in a financial debt nightmare. And the question was always is like, is the vulture capitalist like Elliott going to come in and buy that debt in a loan to own program? But then at Barcelona is basically the flagship for the region of Catalonia. And so now you would like, even if you bought that debt and try to foreclose on it, like now you're spinning into like a Basque Country Catalonian crisis that affects the rest of Spain. Like, who wants to take that on? Although I guess, you know, Elliott took on Argentina. So, I mean, I guess they're not scared of a fight. So,
you know, nobody listening is going to believe that I did not prep you for this call, that we were going this direction, that you just like, I feel comfortable enough asking you these questions, knowing you probably have the answer. Like, I did not know you would know that much in-depth knowledge about German football rules. Kudos to you.
Yeah. No, that's always, yeah, like I said, I spent way too much time on this stuff on the weekends. But by the way, when I was over in Portugal, we went to a Benfica PSG game. Benfica is one of the primary teams in Lisbon. There's Benfica and Sporting, and actually 50% of the Portuguese nationals follow Benfica, this one club. So it's about 15 million people are followers of Benfica, and they're playing against what's called PSG, Paris Saint-Germain, or the club from Paris. And that club in Paris now has United Arab Emirates owners, and they become like the Super League, like the Yankees, where the Parisian team is just buying all the best players in the world. So essentially in soccer, you have the three best forwards in the world right now, and it's arguable, are Messi, Neymar, and Mbappe. Well, they all play for Paris. So they just buy like the top players in the world. And so Benfica was playing Paris in a Champions League game. So luckily, and I was taking my girlfriend to her first European soccer match. For anybody who hasn't been, I highly recommend going. It's very, very different from American sports. They sing their hearts out for 90 minutes. There's tons of chants. It's so crazy. I was sending you some time lapse footage of all like the placards where people were making all these signs and creating all these cool things before the game. But it's absolutely fascinating to go to those games and just see the absolute passion. And for a small club in Lisbon to be taking on these giants in PSG, and they tied the game 1-1, and Messi scored the first goal. So it was great to actually see Messi play live for once. It was just, it was one of those, another, check boxes of games I love to see.
That was another thing that really caught me off guard about this show. How does everyone know the chants? They were new chants every single episode. Totally unique, totally different. Everyone in the audience somehow knew them. It was wild.
Yeah, they always have. What's crazy about it too is I'm sure you'll start to notice is a lot of them are almost based on the cadence of nursery rhymes. So they'll take the rhythm and the melody from like nursery rhymes, and then they adapt it to the club, or they have a song for each player. And so they'll have those like kind of like the framework for each song or the chant that everybody does. But then, you have to learn it over time. But like you or me sitting in the audience, listening to Welsh people do a chant, we would have no idea what they're saying. And I'm sure you're kind of seeing that on the show. It's like, you can't understand, but it's amazing how vocal people are for 90 minutes straight.
So I want to bring this back to influencer marketing, because the other thing I was thinking about was the power of the influencer to start the flywheel,
yes,
right? To bring the sponsors in, to create attention and attraction, but the also potentially dilutive risks to the person's brand.
Yeah.
Right. Like they have to be careful about what they're sponsoring and the quality of what they're sponsoring, and whether it ties together with the bigger things they're trying to promote. Make sure they're not creating cross competition, or it's potentially, from their personal perspective, destroying other sponsorship opportunities. Right. I was thinking about how Ryan Reynolds owns Mint Mobile. You know, that means he's never doing an ad for Sprint or AT&T or Verizon or whomever. Right. You do certain things and they lock you out of other opportunities. It made me really sit back and think about like being strategic as an influencer. Like, what does the big ecosystem look like when you are the thing that creates the flywheel? And then how do you pass that off? Like, how do you make sure the business continues without you having to keep spinning the flywheel?
Man, when you said that, it made me think. Can you imagine if Ryan's wife Blake, like if another mobile company wanted to pay her to run rival ads,
Right.
like
Oh,
how
that'd be
much money
great.
they could get for that? Like it would be a great. I feel like they have the personalities to pull that off, but like they would pay her a fortune to like go against like Mint Mobile in that scenario. Yeah, I think that's as we move into this world, and you and I've talked about this many times. It's like we're all, whether we like it or not, we're all like building a personal brand, right? Like I used to always explain this to my brother, who's a craft cocktail specialist, is like back, I mean, he owns his own restaurants now and everything, but back in the day, like if he was in New York City and going for a bartending job, you know, if he's a great bartender and there's another great craft cocktail bartender, but one of them has like 50,000 followers on Instagram, that person's going to get the job every time. And so we have to accept like the reality we live in, that there's really douchey words, right? Influencer, all of these things, but like people buy from people. And you know, the people that have, you know, that do things like podcasts or shows or the really long form content, you just build up such great relationships with people, and people want to monetize that. Like it's understandable because like you've actually built up really an amazing set of relationships. But then like you said, is like, how do you choose and how do you have the foresight for maybe 5, 10, 20 years for a brand like that, the way like you're saying like Ryan Reynolds is doing? I have no idea. Like how do you, I mean, I'm sure I'm sure if you asked him, if he was here, he'd like say I've made a lot of poor decisions actually along the way. And then probably part of it is why he started Aviation Gin and all that stuff. He's like, I want to own the brand. And that to me is like the next level. Most influencers, as I've seen, like working with you know, people we know and everything, is like they don't realize their worth. And they just think any brand that will pay them $500 to put a post on Instagram, they'll just do it. And I'm like, they have no idea what their value is because, well, understandably, they're not great business people, right? There's one thing to be able to be highly creative and produce content that really that people gravitate towards, but then to have that same mindset that shifts to a business sense is just not there. And so what happens is all of these influencers are totally undervalued because all of them are just taking any table scraps they can get. So the companies take advantage of that. And none of them actually know their worth and are willing to step out and say, no, I demand more. But then the ones that do and figure that out over time, and then you're seeing with Kim K, and we talked about even, you know, the private equity deal she's doing, is like eventually start just owning those businesses because you realize their influence is so powerful that you might as well own the company, not just a piece of the company. I want to own the company now, but like even like LeBron owns a small piece of Liverpool that he got through Fenway Sports Group, even though he was never a Liverpool fan. But like eventually, like, and LeBron's been saying on all of his shows or more publicly, like, I want to own an NBA team. And I think, you know, there's a good chance he gets one in Las Vegas. But it's interesting. Like that's, you know, what we poo-pooed 5 to 10 years ago as social media is a fad and these influencers are going to go away and who cares? These girls are just showing their ass. Now they own billion-dollar brands.
Right. Well, influence, right?
Yeah.
When you think what is influence, it's sales and marketing, and industries have always valued sales and marketing, and now that sales and marketing is encapsulated by a person, right? And that person carries that value with them wherever they go, as long as they don't destroy it, right? We've seen plenty of cases where you lose your stardom and people blow up their influence over bad choices or whatever. But if you can maintain it and grow it, right? Like it's hard to put a dollar value on what it is, right? In and of itself, like if Ryan Reynolds didn't do anything with it, no one else can really monetize it. He has to take action to monetize it, but there is a huge amount of intrinsic value there if he uses it correctly. Right? Think about the Rock has done the same thing. I mean, it's the same as all these celebrities going into alcohol or coffee or whatever they're going into. I think it'll be, they've all done liquor. Big question is what's next, right? What sort of, like, why? I would actually be curious. I never really thought about this, but why did they all choose liquor?
Margins?
Is it margins? Something easily, like it's a direct to consumer type product that their brand actually has some influence. The margins are really good. There was existing supply that they could tap into. They all claim they do. They go find their hyper local important, distillery, and that's the special one. But the reality is, it's not like any of them are out there trying to sell 15-year scotch. It's like, okay, it's
a little tried to say
gin,
margins,
and tequila.
Yeah, it's a little trite to say margins because as you and I know, as we start to explore this more and more, and I already knew from the wine industry is like this is a highly regulated industry when you start talking about alcohol, and it's kind of a nightmare, and it's really hard actually to go direct to consumer due to the tied house laws and 3-tier system that's evident in alcohol. What I actually think it's not just the margins. What they're really doing is what the world doesn't see is that all these CPG companies like your Procter and Gambles of the world, they're no longer paying for R&D. They're much smarter now, like Kellogg's, et cetera. It's like they let all of these micro influencers and all of these entrepreneurs develop a brand and a loyal following. And once they get kind of product market fit and they are able to, get some leverage behind that brand, they just swoop in and buy them for high multiples. So it's really, to me, it's a multiple game. And the highest multiples are in alcohol. I know I have friends that live down the street from me that have sold, companies for 32x multiple of gross revenue. Like that's insane. But that's what happens in alcohol.
Wow.
And so because they want that brand, because if they have your in alcohol, for example, your Diageos of the world, your Brown-Formans, your Constellations, they're massive behemoths and they're really good at distribution and economics at scale, but they're not good at R&D and creating new brands. So if they can buy a brand, especially one that's DTC, that then they can plug in their distribution system to go through the 3-tier system, there's incredible value for them to know. Like, so you made big eyes when I said a 32x multiple, but they know as soon as I put in my distribution system, I'm really buying it at a 5x forward multiple. Because they know exactly, like they're not dumb. They know the math of as soon as I plug and play this into my system and I put it in, Harris Teeter grocery stores, I'm going to absolutely dominate with this brand. And I'm going to take it from 200,000 cases to 1 million cases a year overnight, just because I've developed this distribution system. But part of it, I wonder, like you're saying, is like thinking about The Rock or anything like that. Is like Gary Vee said it best, or it's one of his books. It's like jab, 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 right hook. And I think the best ones, and this is kind of what you're saying about, worrying about your personal brand, is like you give, and then you have an ask. And I think that's what the best ones have done. Some of them have gone right for the ask, right, and started a liquor company or whatever right out the gates, and they fall on their face. But the ones that have provided value for decades at a time, then it's easier for them to go that ask because people have really gotten to know them, they've grown with them, and they'll kind of buy anything they put out there.
Well, it's about the authenticity. I'm going to use air quotes here, authenticity and perceived brand value of that person, right? Like, have you built a connection with the audience that you are ultimately trying to sell to? And does the audience think that this is just a shill, right? Are you just pitching this because you're trying to make money, or like, oh, is this a passion project? You want to revitalize this town through a soccer team, like, right? There's a little bit of a masquerading that goes on there to try to, The Rock, for him, it's all about the passion of working out in his Under Armour collaboration. And he tries all the products before they go to market, or he really poured his heart and soul into his tequila and it's his ethos distilled in alcohol. Like, bullshit. But it makes for a great narrative, and he drinks it while eating a whole bunch of pancakes after working out. Like, cool lifestyle, man. I'm in. So
you had to get the pancakes in there because I know you're a huge fan of his cheat meals and pancake day stacking.
I'm all about pancakes. Yeah. It's endlessly fascinating to me because it is still so divisive. Like, people still find the influencer economy almost insulting. And I sit there, and I've said it to a number of my peers. I've said it to employees of mine. I have encouraged friends to be more proactive in trying to control their personal brand, because that is an asset you can take everywhere with you in life and into everything you do. And your goal, if you are trying to, grow an empire of sorts, no matter how big or small that empire is, like, that personal asset is insanely valuable when applied. It gives you a tremendous amount of leverage in all sorts of situations.
I know I'm smiling because I know you sell. And when you're even saying personal brand or personal asset, just like me, your sphincter is just fucking tightening up.
Oh, yeah.
Even though
I
we know
like such an asshole.
No, but like, we both know this, but like, even talking, like, using the words influencer, personal brand, personal asset, it's still, like you're saying, that's still the friction there. And that's why the economy doesn't quite understand it yet. I mean, obviously the Kardashians understand it perfectly. The other one, God, I don't think we ever talked about. Did you see like some of the OnlyFans numbers that came out?
No. Well, I may have. When did they come out?
This may be a month ago, Whereas like Black China, they alleged made $150
Yes,
million
I
last
did
year.
see this. Yes.
God, please. Okay, I'll stop because we probably ended up talking about that because that's so fascinating. And I think Cardi B made like 50 million, and that's like cash in 1 year. Like that's insane amounts of money. But then once again, it's OnlyFans. But so before I transition to something else, and I swear this whole talk
But wait,
about
hold on. But the
okay, okay.
OnlyFans thing, I hate to interrupt, but I really want to, because you might like, okay, there's a sexual aspect of that potentially in certain situations, but I'm not so sure it's all that different than people supporting their favorite podcast through Patreon, right?
Yeah,
Like
no, like
there's
Cardi B's
podcasts.
is not naked. Cardi B's is
Yeah.
not naked. It's because it's to your point, and like even DJ Khaled has one too. But like you're saying, it's a
Yeah.
form of Patreon they're using that way.
Yeah, people have forever celebrated celebrity, and they like to feel close. Do I feel a need to give Cardi B my $2 a month? Absolutely not. I think she's doing just fine without me, but there's other people who want access to that special content and are willing to pay it to feel close.
It was amazing to me to think too, like how just positioning in matters is like Patreon always just didn't feel quite right, but now Substack feels right to people. But there's no difference between Substack and Patreon. But for some
Right.
reason that works out. Maybe the naming in Patreon just felt, I don't know, different for people. Where I was going to transition to it, I swear this whole thing wasn't a prelude with personal brand and alcohol businesses and everything. Is the update on the rum stuff
Oh,
is
that's right.
we get samples sent to your house, but you and I've been in Europe, so we haven't been able to connect. So you've got all these samples just staring you and teasing you and calling your name
Yeah.
every day, and you haven't tried them.
And,
Do you just walk by and smell them every day, or
and
what do you do?
samples, by the way, I want to be clear to people, like the amount of rum that I got sent is definitely equivalent to like a 750. There is
I
so
think
much rum. Like I probably have 12 bottles of rum that are like, I don't know, like the size
they're
of my
like
hand.
they're 50 centiliters a piece, I think, right? Or no,
I
are they
think they're
100?
more than that. I think they're 100.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a lot, and it's all, by the way, not diluted, so they're all like
Oh, yeah.
120 proof, 140 proof, and so that's part of. They smell really good, and they have such a variety of smells, and it's fun because you get the age on that, but you don't necessarily get the location. And I can smell it and be like, that is clearly from Jamaica. It's got that weird banana funk, or another one will have that like, okay, this is clearly. I don't know if you did any agricoles. I think you did, because some of them smell much more like lemongrass. And then there's others that clearly have that molasses, deeper, darker smell to them. So I'm super excited to try them, but I didn't want to try them alone. I've been waiting for you.
Yeah, I guess we gotta film it in some way, shape, or form when we do actually try them, but we'll figure it out eventually. So it wouldn't be pirates if we didn't spend the first half hour plus talking about nothing to do with finance. So
Yeah.
and then so I'll transition us, but also the other thing we don't talk about is what's topical in the news these days. But goddamn, if I had to bring up Liz Truss resigning after 44 days. Like that, and not that I
Yes.
have anything to say about it. That was just like, holy shit, when I was on
Well,
calls today, seeing that like breaking
yeah.
news.
But fascinating segue if you want to talk about finances. I would love to
Yeah.
talk to you about UK rates
LDI.
and what happened with gilt and LDI. I mean, a really fascinating look into the world of pension structure and thinking about the implications of using leverage as a hedge, right?
Yeah.
And what that does to your portfolio construction. So there's a lot of moving pieces here, but for those who perhaps did not follow, there was a very violent move in long dated gilt rates, interest rates, that caused significant problems for UK pension funds who were allocating to highly levered pooled vehicles to give them levered exposure in gilts as a way to hedge their liabilities. So the way to think about like the way a pension is set up is that they have these far dated liabilities that they owe their pensioners. Just think about that as being short a bond, right? Like, and it's all got all sorts of when the money's due, but just think about it from an accounting perspective. They are ultimately short a long dated bond, and it's a big bond position. And so the best thing they can do from an accounting perspective is hold a big bond position. But if they only hold a big bond position, it doesn't leave them any money left over to try to grow their assets and get to a more than 100% funded status in the pension to make sure they can actually do the payouts. So these corporations, they don't want to keep throwing cash, or these public pensions, they don't, from the municipalities, don't have enough cash to throw at the hedge and just buy bonds. So what they do is they buy levered bond exposure. This is something we do in the US. It's something they do in the UK. And that's just really meant to hedge the interest rates. And that might seem a little counterintuitive, but the thing to remember is that liability is a short interest rate position. It's a short bond position. So as rates go up, they're losing money on their hedge, but their liability is also going down. So it's nice and matched. And if you're not levered, you just have you have a 1-for-1 match, great. You're all set. You've immunized your future liabilities. Interest rate movements don't matter. But suddenly, if you're levered and you get a margin call, well, things start to get squirrely. And there were two really interesting things that I found really fascinating. Well, actually, three really interesting things. The first is, okay, you get a margin call. Well, all that really means is you just need to sell off some other assets to fund the margin call and you're fine, right? Well, what we know is a huge number of pensions internationally have moved into private assets, private credit, private equity, private real estate, illiquid. So where are they getting the capital from to rebalance? Suddenly rebalancing their portfolios becomes a big issue. Two, these were not individually managed separate accounts. They were pooled vehicles. Why does this matter? Well, let's say Corey and Jason are both pension funds, and Corey only has $10 million and Jason has $90 million. We put that in to get the hedge exposure to this pooled vehicle, and the pooled vehicle suddenly has a margin call. Corey goes, hey, I've got all this liquid stuff. I can fund my part of the margin call. And Jason goes, I don't know what to tell you. I was investing all my assets in private stuff. I can't fund the margin call. Suddenly, Corey gets completely fucked by Jason being irresponsible, because Corey could fund his part of the margin call, but Jason couldn't, and the pooled vehicle goes bust, right? So that's number two, is like the pooled structure of this really almost blew up on all these smaller pensions, some who could fund, some who couldn't. And then the third part is none of this matters if you can survive the call, if you can survive the capital call, right? If all of a sudden you get a margin call, if you can pony up the money, great. But what happened is rates spiked. All of a sudden, all these funds blew up. And by blowing up, they got the hedge ripped off. And after the hedge ripped off, rates plummeted. Yep. Which meant they had no hedge, and all of a sudden their liability went back up in value. So the reason the spike and the plummet happened was because of all the margin calls. So the margin calls created an underfunded situation in UK pensions. And the big fear, the reason the Bank of England had to step in was because they were creating this cyclical fire sale. The Bank of England wasn't trying to suppress rates. The Bank of England was trying to create an orderly exit from the market, so you didn't get all these mass capitulation, leaving all these pension funds unhedged to then suddenly have their liability blow out against them as rates collapse. So this was just like a fascinating case study of things on paper versus things in practice, and all these corner cases that, like, who would have thought that pooled vehicles would have been the thing to totally fuck over these pensions? Like, I'm not sure I would have thought of that.
Well, there's so many things in there I want to pull on. One is, man, it reminds me so much of there's so many things we've talked about in the past that like happened in this scenario. And one of the things we've always talked about many times is path versus terminus. Right. And especially when their terminus was like 50 to 60 years out. So that's also, in fairness, that's why they were using a lot of the leverage too, is because they had to worry about a 50 to 60 year time horizon. And if they can only get 20-year gilts, they have to use these swaps to be able to get that duration out farther, especially as rates come down. So that's one of the issues that, like, is at least in fairness. But the two, like you're saying with the pooled vehicle, what's interesting about that is, like you're saying, and to talk about fairness there, is like, if you only have a corporation in Britain that has maybe $20 million in liabilities they need to cover, nobody's going to do an SMA for them, because the people that are doing SMAs for these vehicles they're usually charging like single digit bips. Like there's no money in it. So that's why they forced pooled vehicles. Like if you were trying to take care of a pension that was $20 million, they're going to pull you up with, 20 other pensions at $20 million. And that's why they were in pooled vehicles. And that's why they didn't have SMAs. But like thinking about the path versus determinists, like you're saying, is like they were hedged and it was all good. But just like the LME or anybody trading commodities and futures and hedging their position as an actual like grower of crops, this is once again that path versus terminus, and they got a margin call and they couldn't make it, right? And then the third part of that, like we always talk about, is like with things like long volatility and tail risk, is like when you get that margin call, you're going to need to source liquidity from somewhere. And if you don't have liquidity because it's all in private equity, you're screwed. Or if you could source that liquidity like in March of 2020 from your stock positions, you don't want to sell those. But this is why correlations go to 1, because everybody needs to raise cash. And so they sell things they don't need. And that's the entire point of having like tail risk or long volatility, to be able to have some dry powder that has convexity to it. So you don't have to hold that much in case you do get those margin calls. And so those are like the multiple things we've talked about. The one thing I did think was interesting is like how a lot of like the pundits that are very, perma bears, they were like, oh my God, this is it. This is the thing that's going to trigger the cascade around the world. Like, this is it. We're finally going to get that black swan event. It's amazing how they cheer for these things. I don't know what kind of perverse mentality people have. But what's interesting is like, luckily, you and I have an amazing Rolodex. So I called up like Zed Francis from Convexitas. Shout out to Zed, because Zed used to actually do these plans for UK pensions. So I started talking to him about it, and it's obvious, like, no, in the US, we have defined contribution. We do not have the same thing. It's not going to cascade around the world. This is primarily a UK issue. But once again, it's an esoteric world. And what coming back from being in Europe and everything and just watching all this discussion around it, it was really interesting to me, just LDI alone, right? This is what, I always harp on, and I'm sorry if I'm a broken record, is like, 2 months ago, nobody knew what LDI meant. And now we're got to work on this acronym, and everybody's looking up, what does LDI mean? And now all of a sudden, all these global macro tourists are all like experts on LDI, right? Like in every like 3 to 6 months, a new thing comes along, and now everybody's all of a sudden an expert. And as we both know, that's an impossibility. Like you cannot be an expert. You're a dilettante. But yet everybody now is like, all of a sudden they're cram coursing on what does it mean to be LDIs. And then they're pontificating on what the liquidity cascade is going to be around the world, when they don't even, 2 months ago, they had no idea what even LDI was.
Well, I have a good friend who is a very senior consultant in the world of LDI. I'm not going to mention his name because I'm not sure he's comfortable with me mentioning his name on this sort of stuff. But he and I have a lot of conversations about this. And we were actually chatting literally just 2 hours ago. And one of the topics that came up was around these hedges. And we do have pooled vehicles here in the US. Like BlackRock, for example, has a product called Turf that is like this ultra extended long duration product. And he was saying that there's this interesting issue that's happening where pensions are looking at the funds they're allocated to, and they're seeing that some of these super levered funds are down 70, 80% this year. And they're like saying, I can't believe we are down that much. And my friend's point is, well, you're only down that much because it's a hyper levered fund, and therefore you've allocated a small amount to it. We could put you in a less levered fund and you'd have to allocate more to it to get the same hedge. And you'd be down less on a percentage term, but you'd be down an equivalent amount in dollars, right? But they're freaking out from the line item perspective. And he said, and I, part of my comment to him was like, well, in LDI, like, again, you are implicitly, the way to model this is you have a whole bunch of assets and you are short a bond. And the question is, how do you sort of maximize I guess you can even think of it as the Sharpe ratio of your entire portfolio, knowing you have that short bond position, right? The utility function of pensions gets a little weird once you start talking about being overfunded. There's a bunch of accounting rules. So like, you sort of like the utility curve changes, but assuming you're fairly funded, like you're just basically trying to max the Sharpe ratio. And you have this short. And I said, well, why are they looking at it? Like, they're just looking at their assets. Like, when you give a pension report, shouldn't these people who are looking at this also be looking at the value of their liability? And so you should be looking at the net exposure, right? And what's happened is, yes, your hedge has gone way down in value, but so has your liability as rates have gone up. The present value of those future liabilities has gone way down. And so net, like, you might actually be better off from a funding perspective. And he said, and this was really interesting, he said, Yes, but LDI is actually a fairly new concept in the broad scheme of things. It's only kind of like 20 years old. And a lot of these pensions are older than that. And the reporting is still somehow lagging that view of the world. Like, not everyone agrees that that's the way you should manage a pension even. It's still a modern concept compared to pensions, which are 60, 70, 80 years old in the US. And so I sit there and I look at it and I go, who really cares if the hedge is down, if the liability's down? And nope, some people really care, and not just care about the dollars you've lost, they care about the percent that's showing up on the line item. And again, to me, that's just framing is creating a bias that's leading to potentially incorrect decisions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that. And like as you referenced even before in the SMAs, they were doing capital calls at regular intervals going into this, so they were perfectly fine. It was the pooled ones that didn't do the capital calls to the last minute, and then like saying some people couldn't put up the capital because like they had used that leverage to be able to get into private equity. But like you said, if marked a model or path versus terminus, they were just fine. But like, and in the interim, if somebody wants cash, then you got a problem, right, from your financing source. But like you said, it got into a better scenario. Sorry, do you want to go somebody else before? Yeah, before I.
Yeah, I got sort of one more point on this because it's a very complicated ecosystem, right? The pension system, whether it's your public or private pensions, you have a number of parties involved who are overseeing the pension, and there's all sorts of regulatory oversight. But there's accounting standards that get involved as well. And so you have these capital market assumptions that get built, and the pension has to meet certain expected growth rates and discount their future liabilities at certain rates that are sort of standardized across the industry. And so in doing that sort of accounting assumptions to protect themselves from a regulatory standpoint, that's one of the things that's pushed them into all this private stuff. Right, is that if you look at any sort of published capital market assumptions that talk about expected returns and volatility, like private equity, private real estate, private credit is smashing the public stuff in terms of expectations. And so they're kind of like, I don't want to say like they're forced into doing it because they can say no. But the problem is if your consultant comes to you with these capital market assumptions and you're the board, like you have to either say, no, you're wrong. Like those are incorrect capital market assumptions. And I'm not sure a board's going to want to do that. Or you have to go with it, in which case you're being sort of forced into these private assets. And I think it's a sticky, we don't give enough credit to like the political issues at play when you have multiple players who are influencing the allocation decisions with different sort of needs, right? Some are thinking about it from a regulatory perspective. Some are thinking about it from an accounting perspective. Some are thinking about it from an actual cash flow perspective. What's the best for the corporation that's sponsoring the program versus like they don't want to put dollars in. Having too big an asset on the balance sheet looks good, looks bad. Like there's all sorts of considerations that get funky here. But I do think there needs to be some acknowledgement of like, yeah, they're piling into privates, but the pensions are kind of being forced there by the capital market assumptions they're being given. I'm not sure they have a choice necessarily.
Well, that's what you and I have this recurring theme of like, show me your incentives or constraints, right? Like you started with me having to even change my Twitter handle, right? Like this isn't like go anywhere, do anything you want. Is like everybody has these regulatory constraints that force them to do inopportune things. And everybody's like, well, how could they be just so stupid? And you go, well, let's look at the regulatory literature. Maybe they had to do this. And so that's part of the issue is, and then like you said, then the capital markets issue adds another constraint, and then your board has another constraint, and then PR of what this will look like has another constraint, and then relative value versus everybody else in your pension endowment field and what you do compared to them and keeping up with the Joneses, and then saying we all got down together and it's a Black Swan event, like those kinds of things are all factoring into what they're doing. It's not just people trying to pick the best product or best solution for their needs. It's all of these other factors that are affecting what they're doing.
Yeah.
Okay. I got to change.
We can switch topics. Yeah.
Okay. One, by the way, it reminded me of but I did forget when you were talking about books earlier. You're gonna love this. So you always make fun of me, or I always just send you pictures that like I travel with 2 carry-on bags for months at a time, and it just boggles your mind how I'm able to do it. Which is why I don't have my pirate sweater, which I apologize for. I actually really wish I had the pirate sweater here in Philly right now. It's a little bit cooler here than anticipated. But the other thing I did on this trip, I packed 6 books with me. in those 2 carry-ons too. So that's gonna blow your mind. I had 6 books with me, but I didn't finish a single book. So I just carried 6 books through,
It was just a workout.
yeah, it was just adding to the weight of my carry-ons. But yeah, I packed 6 books in 4 cities, and I didn't read any of them over the last 4 weeks. So, but as I'm still technically traveling in away from home, hopefully I'll get some time to read them here in Philly or Miami or Cayman when we see each other next. But yeah, just to blow your mind. Yeah, not only did I have all my clothes in those 2 carry-ons, I also had 6 books this time.
I keep claiming it's just because I'm bigger than you. My clothes take up more room. That's why I can't do it.
You know what it is, actually. I'll be frank with you. And I think I've told you this before. It's like you like to work out, and I don't. So I don't have any workout clothes in my bag, and that would be like that's twice the size right there, right? Just the workout clothes alone. And you are much bigger. And then my secret weapon is merino wool. So hopefully I've turned you on to that. I know Tyler's a big fan now. So changing subjects, our mutual homie Ben Eifert, shout out to Ben, was on Hugh Hendry's podcast. I don't know if you got a chance to watch it.
I did.
Okay. One of the things they were talking about in there is something that you and I have talked a lot about privately. And so I want to get your take, although this is a little more nuanced maybe than things we've talked about before, is your classic like 60-40 portfolios or anything that's semi-similar to that is, they had maybe reduced or, whether it's other active managers or pension or endowments, they had reduced their equity exposure going into 2022 and this kind of slow grind drawdown, right? And Ben was insinuating, people had less equity exposure, at least on the active management side. So people aren't reaching for tail risk hedges. And that's why we haven't necessarily seen a pop in equity vol or equity long vol or tail risk, whatever you want to call it. And so, but then they started to insinuate. And so you and I have talked about that. It's like, okay, if you're reducing that exposure, especially if you have more of a trend following overlay, if the market rips back higher, you have less exposure on. So you're going to have less participation on that equity market rally. So what starts to happen, though, this is like getting into more nuance that maybe you and I have talked about. So I want to get your take is like, okay, what if you start having a lot of these dead cat bounces, especially we saw from like 2000 to 2002, where you start seeing these market rallies, right? And then the active managers are realizing, oh, I've got on less equity exposure. I keep missing out on these rallies. My clients are getting pissed. So now I'm going to start chasing these rallies, and they don't, they're chasing the rallies. And then also we have the big sell off and nobody's bought any hedges. And so not only where people went from underexposed to no hedges, they now go to overexposed because they're chasing like 4 or 5 rallies on maybe like the equity bond portfolios. And then that's what opens us up to kind of like an air pocket for a crash.
Yeah. So to like the phrase that comes to mind, right, is the risk is to the upside. And I think we got to think about like 2 parties. So I agree with Ben's perspective. All the major levered players that I track have been massively delevered all year.
Right.
The number one question I receive is like, Corey, when's the liquidity cascade going to happen? It's not. There's unless there's some party out there that's massively levered that I don't know about that's going to get some massive margin call and cause more margin calls. Like CTAs have the lowest exposure to equities they've ever had in like the last 5 or 6 years, like lower than 2020 right now. Risk parity is delevered. Target vol is delevered. Like all of these big levered players who could simultaneously delever, they're already out of the market. Fundamental hedge funds have taken down their longs dramatically, which means, they are starting to look at the at least this is what the data is suggesting, is that they are starting to say that the risk is not participating in the downside. The risk is failing to participate in the upside, which means they've been buying calls, right, is what the data seems to suggest. Which, right, means that there is still, like, if the market starts to rally, you sort of get this reverse effect where all of a sudden you can have delta hedging from dealers cause this pro-cyclical spiral, violent move to the upside because you have all these out of the money calls that are moving towards at the money, picking up delta, which could then invite all the CTAs to rebuy. You saw the CTAs buy this summer. They had sold off entirely. They all rebought equities during the rally. I would argue helped fuel the rally, and then sold everything off again. For CTAs, positioning risk is to the upside. That's where all the flow will be. So I think there is considerable potential for violent bounces. I think Jem Carson would argue like that's why violent bounces happen. right? Is because that rapid repositioning. That all said, so you say, okay, for these players, the risk is to the upside. For the market as a whole, the risk is always to the downside. I mean, just like you look at the world of investors, we are just net long risk assets. Your average advisor's book of business looks like a 60-40. That's just what their client profile looks like. You look at dollar weighted retirement 401k and glide paths, it looks like a 60-40. Like, and that stuff's not changing. It's not like all of a sudden the every 2 weeks the money going into 401ks isn't buying on their glide path. It's just systematically buying on the glide path. So I think what you really have right now is a world of levered players who have delevered, and then just a world of stubborn longs. And I think it's going to take this, like, to really see any sort of capitulation, you need fear in the stubborn longs. And I'm not sure the 60-40 being down 20% is enough fear. Like, I'm just not sure we're there yet for people to really capitulate and say, I'm going to go into my 401k and sell out of my qualified default fund and move to cash. Like, I don't think the news or the headlines are scary enough, or the market action is scary enough to start to warrant that behavior.
Yeah, and I think that they're also probably sitting on the laurels of the last like 3 years on the equity side of their book, taking off so much. So they're like justifying to themselves. They don't mind that 60-40 is down 20% because of what happened to the rest of the portfolio over the last 3 years, plus their house sitting in there.
Well,
as we know, housing's buying.
Adam Butler would yell at me and say, they've been winners for the last decade plus. Like, okay, they can suffer for a year.
Yeah, and who knows if they'll suffer. But I think it's interesting thinking about if that risk to the upside, like you're saying, is it starts to manifest and then like it starts getting choppy, but we're seeing those kind of rips higher, is like how many of the levered players, and depending on their look back period, really start to lever into that position before it has like a free fall to the downside and nobody protected. And then so part of that, trying to segue here too, is like part of that, then nobody's buying protection, and then all of a sudden everybody's chasing protection, and then you get, that bid on tail risk protection. But part of that was, did we have a question for like Ask Two Pirates that was related to, because if nobody's reaching for tail protection, and then when they start doing that, creates a buffer because of the market makers, taking the other side of that trade to the downside. So if you don't have that buffer, then you can have that free fall. But didn't we have a question on like Ask Two Pirates that maybe got asked to you about how do we track market flows or something like that? How's it a retail trader?
It was a very specific question from someone who was looking to place trades in individual equities, and was just basically asking, like, how do you track potential flow pressure into equities? And I've had a number of people ask me about this, like whether flow is going to become its own factor, and you could create like a factor ETF of high versus low flow over underweight flow pressure. It is an incredibly nascent field of research still. There's been stuff written for decades, but like it's coming out more rapidly. And the estimates are still like very broad estimates in terms of like when you talk about trying to measure flow elasticity particularly in individual names. So I don't think we're there yet. There might be firms that do something like that. And I know there are hedge fund managers, right, who explicitly trade flow, index inclusions, deletions, corporate actions, all that sort of stuff. But just broadly, like if you're looking to buy a stock, is there an easy way to estimate whether there's flow risk? I know some hedge fund managers who will look at the largest owners and try to get a sense of like who could dump or who might be adding, but it's very hard, difficult work and filled with a bunch of guesswork.
Yeah, that's what I was going to get into. It was like, I was trying to think of how I could alienate or piss off everybody on every side of that equation. But like, I saw the truncated version of the question, so I didn't really see it. I thought it was mainly talking about how to look at options flow or market maker flow. And as we know, like how hard that is. And we know managers that run on that flow and they build their positions around it, but we know other managers that don't. And I was going to bring up, like Ben Eifert was saying as well, is like, he was talking about in other trading situations is like, how do you really get flow? Oh, you be on a trading desk for 2 decades and build up relationships. So on your Bloomberg chat, you're all talking to each other about where the largest like Canadian pensions are and where that flow is coming in. And so you can never model that. And then especially with dark pools and all the other technology now with iceberg orders and different ways to implement your order, it's really, really hard to track option flow. And then like you're saying, like single name flow is even harder. And like, you don't really know what the players are doing. Is this a hedge or is this not a hedge? But more importantly, that's why, we get this question from retail traders all the time. And it's just like, you can't. Like it's just like that hard, and even professionals can't really. And then they're aggregating also all those like relationships on their Bloomberg chat, and that's how they figure it out. And like, how do you get those relationships? Well, you got to have experience. So it's just one of those catch-22s.
And by the way, even if you can model it, is it useful for whatever you're trading? Right? Like, are you trading the horizon over which that stuff makes sense? A lot of this stuff, when you're talking about flow and like CTAs suddenly being buyers, like my models would suggest CTAs, even the market would have to rally 5 or 6% before CTAs become meaningful buyers, right? And I can sort of guesstimate what the flow might be there, but I don't know who's selling into that flow potentially, right? There's a whole bunch of unknowns. But is my job, like when I think about the mandates that I run, is my job to try to create alpha out of a 2-week move? It's really not. Like for the types of mandates I run, that's not the speed at which I'm moving money around. They're much longer term premia that I'm trying to harvest. And so I can be aware of it. And a lot of the way I think about this stuff is if I think there is a really big asymmetric risk that represents a risk to my portfolio's positioning, like there's a really particular path that could happen in the market that would be very detrimental to my current positioning, either from an absolute or relative return perspective. I then think about, is there a convex hedge I can put on and how much do I have to pay to hedge that particular path? But it's not as often about how can I make alpha, right? I sort of have my long-term risk premium bets already in place. It's then about, for example, if I'm underweight equities and underweight bonds, and I think the market has sold off dramatically in both equities and bonds, and they're exhibiting a high correlation right now, and there's a good chance of a rebound, probabilistically, which I think will get chased by a bunch of buyers, could send the market up 15%, and it's going to make me lag my benchmark by 1,000 basis points. Like, am I willing to take that bet, or do I want to spend 20 or 30 basis points of my annual hedge budget just hedging that one risk over the next month and a half? Maybe, maybe not. It sort of depends. Like, those are sort of the things I think about when I look at this sort of data, not, okay, suddenly I need to reposition my entire book.
Or does it affect the way you would maybe leg into a position instead of, for rebalancing timing luck?
Yeah, I mean, especially with options, absolutely. Like, I think this sort of stuff is useful for thinking about options resets and monetization potentially, but I'm sure that's a highly debatable opinion.
Got it. So a little bit of housekeeping as we're past an hour now. Today's obviously not Friday. So I take full responsibility for us not putting out a show in the last 4 weeks as I was in Europe. So it's entirely my fault. Us not releasing on Friday this week is entirely Corey's fault. But
My bad.
we appreciate the 17 hardcore members of the Booty Crew, especially the comment section as always. Tyler, can you throw up the question link again? Also, like we're trying out this Ask Two Pirates. And so I think it's, submit questions to ask2pirates@gmail.com. We appreciate all the questions and, everybody in the Booty Crew as well. So Corey, though, I think we're not on next Friday, right? Are we? We're adjusting.
Yeah, I'm flying again. I've decided to push all my flights to Friday afternoons. So we will be adjusting again.
So we'll adjust again. Once again, we'll eventually get back to our regular scheduling programs on Fridays. But in the meantime, you can find him on Twitter at C. Hofstein, and you can find me on Twitter now at Jason C. Buck. Once again, none of this is investment advice. Do your own due diligence. Seek out proper investment professionals for these crazy markets that we're in. But once again, we appreciate everybody joining. We'll be back next week. We don't know a day or time yet, so it'll pop up into your feed, and we'll figure it out. But as always, shout out to the world famous Booty Crew. And Tyler, roll the outro.